Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Global Randomization and Inventory Awareness, 2 case studies on mid-study RTSM transitions and modifications. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Axiom Real-Time Metrics, who developed the content for this presentation. Axiom Real-Time Metrics delivers intuitive, powerful, and cost-effective eClinical solutions and services focused around your entire study. Services include data management, data analytics, biostatistic, and pharmacovigilance. Axiom's eClinical suite, Fusion, delivers a powerful range of innovative end-user focus, unified functionality, and 15-plus modules, including RTSM, CTM tracking, and much more. Axiom serves as a connected hub for your entire clinical study data and operational needs. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's event. And actually, I'm just going to introduce you to one of your speakers, and then Andrew will introduce you to the rest. So I'd like Andrew to put on his webcam as I introduce Andrew. So Andrew Schachter is the founder and chief executive officer at Axiom Real-Time Metrics, Inc., where he provides the visionary leadership of integral to the company's more than 19 years of clinical technology and managed services success. Axiom's Fusion eClinical Suite, premier unified eClinical platform, has been used to run hundreds of studies across a wide range of therapeutic areas, from phase 1 to global phase 3 studies and registries. So, Andrew, I'm going to let you introduce Heather and Lauren. So I'll pass the mic over to you.
Sonia, thanks so much for the introduction. Greatly appreciate it. We're excited to be here today. As you indicated, our goal today is to talk about randomization, inventory management, supply chain management, and really bring a global conversation to the key elements within this area. One of the greatest challenges that we face in managing inventory is, of course, what inventory do we have? What are the blind spots that are happening because we're doing things on paper? How can we eliminate so many of the challenges that we face when inventory management doesn't speak to the dynamic nature of what happens in studies? It's very often behind the scenes. To that end, as you already mentioned, Sonia, Axiom's unified suite has a complete RTSM environment and package, and that module really enables single sign-on to everything to do with randomization and inventory management. The tools connected with that have the ability to connect with optional EDC, so that the information that is very often disconnected from randomization, which is the EDC data and the related activities, can be directly linked into a centralized platform. Today, we're going to talk about a few things. One, we're going to discuss the design phase. How do you build out IRT? How do you do it right? How do you do it in a relatively related time frame to we know how we run studies today, which means quickly. How do you manage mid-study technology transition? So what happens when you got to make a change in the middle of the process? And then what are the things that you should think about when you consider an RTSM system and the overall needs for a partner in the implementation therein? To that end, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about 2 real-world examples, how they work for leading pharmaceutical and biotech organizations implementing and managing the overall tasks. And we're going to look at one going from paper to a standalone IRT. And then secondly, how do you manage a significant implementation that ends up with modifications due to things happening within the study environment itself? Before we get started, as Sonia mentioned, I want to introduce my colleagues who are going to participate in today's session. And Lauren, Turn it over to you first, Heather.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather DiFrusicia. I'm the Associate Director of RTSM, so Randomization and Trial Supply Management. And with myself and the team, we're able to support all of our clients in many of these types of transitions. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about that today.
Thanks, Heather. Lauren? Lauren, you might be on mute.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lauren Glenn, and I'm the Director of Clinical Operations at SwanBio. And I'm here to talk to you about RTSM and the issues and challenges and things we've seen.
Thanks, ladies.
So first, we're going to talk about the design phase. It's important to realize what you put into it is what you get out. So one of the most important things in designing as RTSM from the sponsor side of things is actually to sit and consider RTSM way in the beginning. When you're going through and you're looking through different challenges of studies and things that you've seen in the past, it's important to take all those bits of information and bring it all the way back pre-protocol. When you sit down to discuss the protocol, sometimes the little things seem to be forgotten. And some of those things is IRT, for example, how your kits are being distributed, how things are being traceability and the visibility you want with your product. So it's important to kind of see those things through early on so you can have the appropriate design. You need to understand what the goals of the programs are. Like I mentioned, the kit design and kind of planning out the process and the flow of the product and all of the CTM product, not just the drug supply itself. It's really important to make it easy on the site. The design that you make in the IRT on the sponsor side has a substantial downstream effect onto the site. So the easier that we can make it on the site, the more they want to use it and the more that they don't give you a hard time about using it. And then, like I said, the visibility of it and being able to trace your product throughout the course of the study is extremely important. Every study has different needs and different risks. So like on the screen, you'll see that there's different things like your randomization scheme, how you randomize, is it double blind or single blind, is it open label? The scheme itself is typically different. Your blinding requirements, how you blind, as well as the different types of dosing and trial supplies. Some of the things that are important to realize is that when you're doing the dosing and dispensing schedule is that there's nothing more important than a clear pharmacy manual. A pharmacy manual that isn't clear makes it very difficult for your external vendors in order for them to create your IRT system. The more information you can put in not only helps the external vendors, but it also helps the sites in accessing that information and teaching themselves how to use the IRT system in line with the way that they want to dispense your drug product. Things that you need to think about when you go back to the IRT is things about, especially when it comes to weight-based dosing. A weight-based dosing product is tricky. You need to make sure that you collect that information into the system before you know what kind of dosing requirements you need. And that does ultimately affect your drug supply in the site and then as well in the depot. So having that information into the IRT system is very important. When we go through and discuss tracking your clinical trial material and everything that's required, there are different types of things in order that you would need to track. Things along your devices, the drug product itself, of course, any ancillary supplies that the sponsor is providing, lab supplies. We've tracked tablets and phones and ePros through this. And then your shipping and storage conditions. So being able to track within the IRT system that the product was shipped under the correct conditions, received in the correct packaging, and being able to have that in a system versus in a paper format is really useful for you to be able to control your inventory, as well as being able to know the site's needs and kind of what they need on their side. The sponsor also needs to ensure that they provide you with a clear investigator brochure. So an investigator brochure that details out, maybe not as specific as the pharmacy manual, but really helps you create the pharmacy manual in detail and provides enough information about the drug product is very helpful at the start of the study. And the earlier you can get that, of course, the better.
And just to chime in there, Lauren, on the clear IBs, where it can be really helpful is that also is key in laying out what the shipping and storage conditions are. We've seen IBs that aren't very clear, and then that's when you have to get QA involved, you have to get other parties involved, so then everyone can be on the same page prior to actually moving forward with the protocols that the depot requires, and making sure that there's clear requirements for the sites, for the storage, as well as on the monitoring side, to make sure that everything is matching. So that's definitely a good one.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, when you go through these needs and things, it's really important to ensure you have the right partner. Picking a vendor in order to do the IRT for the sponsor is extremely important. There's different things that you look into a partner, and it's important that the company selects one that works great for that study, which may not be for future studies, for all studies, but for a specific study needs, it's important to go through that. And all of these things combined, your goals, the needs of the studies, the procedures, and the right partner is what ultimately will give you a successful study.
And on that right partner, we're going to talk quite a bit about that today too. So you'll be able to take your checklist away. Okay, so just kind of transitioning a bit here and focusing on the RTSM stakeholders. So there's many different parties that are involved, and some can be forgotten. So it's really important to be able to lay all of those out and make sure that everyone's aligned, as we alluded to earlier. So we have, of course, the sponsor, and we noted kind of what is upper management expectations. Lauren was touching on kind of the program goals, making sure that that's being met and considered while you're going through this design phase. I touched on the QA aspect, making sure that all of the procedures and the requirements and how you're going to conduct the trial are compliant. And then also, of course, the study team needs. So those are the personnel, it can be clinical, it can be the supply team. They're going to be working on the day-to-day activities, and we need to make sure that their needs are met. Just kind of dropping down and looking at some of our vendors. So there's the CROs or any other key vendors. And so part of it is what are they capable of, but what are you looking for? So having defined responsibilities for the supplier, what are their timelines, what's their availability, and being able to track IP, not just focusing on, okay, IP needs to get to the subject, we have to go backwards. So how is it going to get to the subject? It needs to get to the site first, it needs to get to the depot first, it needs to be ready at the supplier. You need to have all of those, as I noted, those roles and responsibilities clearly defined. What are those lead times at each point? So then you have a clear understanding of, is this going to align with management's timeline? So being very clear at all of those points as to what those processes are. And we're going to talk about this later, but we always recommend asking way too many questions, or what's considered too many questions. It's important to get those on the table. You don't want to be assuming, and that's especially when you're talking about inventory, because there are so many parties involved, as you can see here. The other parties that we don't want to forget are the monitors. So making sure that there's a clear understanding, kind of jumping back to the blinding requirements. Do you need a blinded component and an unblinded component? Do you need any, what is the role that the monitors are going to play? Are they going to be helping with disposal and returns at the sites? How often are they going to be on site? And are there any remote responsibilities, which of course is extremely important these days. And of course the sites, making sure what are the site's needs, what is the site workflow? So how does it physically work in the real world? We can, again, make all of these assumptions, but sometimes it's as easy as just saying, hey, this is the protocol, this is what we had in mind. How would your pharmacy do this normally? And that can really help Not only we talked about the clear pharmacy manual up front, but we also want to make sure that there's not too many revisions required or database adjustments required, because that initial workflow didn't really work and resulted in protocol deviations or lots of questions. So that kind of wraps up the stakeholders piece. So a couple of things to note on the design phase. Lauren, Andrew, anything that you wanted to add there before we go into, I think, our first poll question? Okay. So go ahead, Andrew. Hey,
Heather. I did have one quick comment. The reality of it is I think a lot of people, they underestimate what's involved, obviously, in doing IRT. And the one comment I would make to that whole list is it's all about starting sooner. I think the earlier someone actually really thinks about this, the better. Because as you mentioned, you know, with the IB, just as one example, there's never enough information in IRT. In other words, the more you have, the better off you are, because it's just there's so many things to consider. So the earlier that's approached, I think it really does make a very big difference to it.
And to tag on to that point, so it's not just starting early, it's also including vendors and having those discussions early. And we'll get into this later, but there's so many different perspectives, and it's easy to just kind of have your blinders on and be focused on the kind of key areas that you're comfortable with, or you're familiar with, or you're used to. But when you bring all of these different heads together, then you're able to really see that full picture. And that means that you're going to have a clear understanding of what you need, and you're going to be able to have that more solid, concrete design phase.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, our first poll question.
All right.
Select your key complaints when working with randomization and/or trial supply vendors.
Okay, so I will launch that poll question right now, and the audience members should see it in front of them. Just like Andrew said, the question is select your key complaint or complaints when working with randomization and or trial supply vendors. So please go ahead and select one. This is done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. And once I've closed the polls, I will share the results with everyone. So the question again is select your key complaint or complaints when working with randomization and or trial supply vendors, and select one: technology, poor planning, team fit, data access issues, end user challenges, or all of the above. So please go ahead and cast your vote. It looks like we have the majority of our members have done so. So thank you very much for doing that. I'll leave another 10 seconds for those of you who have not. So if you can go ahead and do so now, it would be greatly appreciated. And I will close the polls. Okay, looks like everyone has cast their votes. So thank you. I'm now going to close the polls and share the results. So the question was select your key complaint or complaints when working with randomization and or trial supply vendors. And the results are 15% at technology, 0% at poor planning or team fit, 23% at data access issues, and 31% at end user challenges, and 31% again, all of the above. So thank you everyone for participating in that last poll question. Now back to Andrew, Heather, and Lauren.
Sounds great. Sonia, my one question is to you. The next poll question, can we have some Jeopardy music?
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, because it was very, very quiet. I was waiting in tremendous anticipation.
I'll get a drum roll going too.
Sounds good.
There you go.
So ladies, the next thing I wanted us to talk about was sort of the best practices, things to think about when you're involved in a change, a transition, mid-study changes. I know, Heather and Lauren, you have been through many. Lauren, we've known you've been through a few where while your hair is long, you might have thought about pulling it out through that process. So love to chat about that for the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay, so actually I can start us off a little bit, and actually just to go back to touch on the poll answer. So thank you everyone for participating there. I think it's interesting to see that tech is a big piece, the data access, end users, and of course, as kind of expected, there's that all of the above. And we'll kind of talk about some of those areas and why those were the trigger to move forward with either a transition or update. But before we get too far, we are going to just talk about mid-study changes in general. So when you're looking at a mid-study change, we have, of course, the two buckets that we touched on, transitions and updates. And so it really is starting from a similar process, but we are looking at different scale in the end. And we have a couple different actions required, and a couple different actions are along the way, and to actually go ahead and release. But we start here looking at kind of tracking and monitoring scenarios and data trends. And that's that to be able to identify that a change is needed, or at least we need to discuss the potential. And so one thing that's really important is not just to focus on the individual scenario and the end result. Of course, you want to make sure if there's a scenario that pops up that you want to resolve it as quickly as possible, assess any potential risk, communicate, there's all those key aspects. But then you also want to kind of think bigger picture. So whenever there's a scenario that comes up, what we do is we look at that scenario. Is there anything, it's not just closing it out for that particular item, but it's looking at what else can we do to prevent that from happening again. In addition to that, and sometimes it's something really minor, it doesn't matter, it could, even something minor, if it happens a lot, then of course there's a site burden, there's the burden at the vendor or sponsor to get those actions completed. So there's nothing too small to kind of sit and track and monitor. Is this happening? Is this something that we can do something right now? Is it may require a bigger change, so maybe we want to hold off, but still monitor to see if there's any other cases. And that's where we get into trending. So looking at, do we have on a monthly basis, what kind of distribution and types of scenarios do we see? Is it something where we want to act on it? And that's an ongoing conversation that you should be having between the sponsor and the vendors. There needs to be that transparency, of course the visibility, but the transparency and active communication to determine, okay, where are we at here? Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about number 2?
Yeah, and I think, just along with what you were saying, Heather, is that that you have to keep an eye on the data trends, but it's also important to weigh the risks. So in some cases, as much as you would want to switch your IRT for whatever reason, the risk is too high. It's too much to do in a study, and you plan on doing it instead of in a mid-study, you wait until that particular study is over. So being able to kind of weigh the risks and impacts on a study will help you provide, different options and different choices with whether it's a new vendor or however it's decided to be handled. But it is important to kind of weigh those risks and kind of understanding the landscape of the particular study and of the program before you move ahead with any particular type of plans. As you can see, I like to plan. So anything you can do to plan ahead makes any of these transitions mid-study or within the program as a whole does make it much easier.
Absolutely. So just taking that into the next step. So once you've kind of assessed your options, you've looked at your risks, as Lauren mentioned, then what do we actually need here? What do we want? Because there's so many different types of changes that you could go with. And sometimes it can be that big transition, or it could be just a minor update. So it's really important to kind of workflow it and really lay out what your options are, just going back to assessing options. But kind of expand that. So when we're talking about some of the transitions and the updates, so what are some examples? So updates, it could be just, do we need to do some retraining? Is it a particular site? So going back to your data trends, is it a particular site that we continue to have certain kinds of questions? Is it the same question? Is it because the instructions are not clear, or maybe they're not confident and comfortable with the activity? Maybe we need to get the monitor more involved. And we always recommend including the monitor in any responses to the sites, as they have that solid relationship, or they should have that solid relationship with the site. So kind of keeping everyone in the loop there. So it could be retraining. It could be, as I started talking about, study materials. Maybe you need to make some updates to your cheat sheets, or your tips and tools, or your user guides. Sometimes you need to make something new. Maybe, and I touched on that just there, is you might have this really long document that has all the right information in, but maybe it's not as easy to kind of go through. So why don't you make a little mini cheat sheet? Maybe you should include it in the upcoming study newsletter. There's lots of different ways that you can kind of cover off the retraining and the updates to the study materials. Another one is system updates. So it might not be on the bigger scale where you need to change the system, but sometimes you need to make an update. And when you're talking with your technology partners, then that's something that's really important to understand. How flexible can they be during the study? Because a system update shouldn't be too scary for everyone. It should be a standard process. And of course, the type of update is going to dictate how long it's going to take. And we'll talk a little bit about that in some of our one of our case studies there. The other side is the transition. So integrations, migrations, what aspects are included in that system change, as well as again, Lauren's talking about kind of planning that transition. And this goes into our number 4, which is, when are we going
determining
to go live?
when to go live.
Yeah.
So determining when to pull that trigger, whether, as Heather was alluding to, whether it's just a small system update, but when you decide to make that switch from one to the other, you've got to be ready. So that means all of your training materials are done. If you're switching a whole vendor or implementing something that wasn't there before, and we'll go into that when we do our case studies, but there's a ton of planning that goes up front. That day that it switches, it should not be a big deal. Everybody should already have been trained, the manuals are in place, whether that means monitors are on site for sites that you believe need additional information. But when you pull that trigger to go live, it should be seamless. Of course it won't, but it should be expected. You should strive for it to be seamless, because on the other side, that week's going to be hard for everybody involved in the planning. There will be sites who can't figure it out or didn't log on or, whatever, but trying to come up with the best date to go live, whether that's when the protocol amendment comes out and there's kind of a break in the scheduling, whether it's on a weekend, which I know people like to do them on the weekend, it buys them some time to kind of make sure everything goes swimmingly for Monday morning, whether it's at the end of enrollment and you just wait until all the patients have enrolled. We've done open label extension studies and we've waited until those patients were all randomized. So we weren't kind of, switching databases during randomization. So it's important to look at the various studies and the program as a whole to determine when that transition should be, because that's a really key, important part of planning. And this is our case study, or did you want to talk? So this was me, right?
Yeah.
So this one is the mid-study transition. So I've been through a few of these, and this one kind of is one particular example of a few studies I worked on that had one IRT system for a randomization study, because that's definitely needed, and then a bunch of other studies on the same product line that had no IRT. So it was very difficult for the company as a whole to manage drug supply. What was this on the site level? What was in the depots? How much needed to be in the depots? And here's some of, kind of the overarching things that were going on. There was about 4 studies across 2 different programs, 2 different indications, all of the same product. It was a tablet formulation, so it was a little bit easier on the manufacturing side. And in terms of supply, wasn't an issue, but getting it to a site was something that the company hadn't really put much thought into, and definitely required us to kind of come up with a new system. We needed to kind of come up with a way to kind of make sure that we had drug supply everywhere we needed to. We never had any issue with providing the drug. The way that we did it just wasn't, there was a better way. And so the better way to do it was using an IRT system versus paper. So these 3 different studies had different site documentation at different sites. globally. And it was challenging to be able to know what was anywhere. And you heavily, as a sponsor, heavily relied on the monitor to be able to provide you with the information about which sites had what and how much they needed, and when the patients were coming in. So so I don't know if you want to add anything, Heather, because we did this together.
I can jump in. So another aspect is the depot reporting, which only kind of gives you part of the picture, and that's why there was that heavily reliance on the monitoring, because it's a little bit of a black hole of information. So between the depots and the monitors, then we're able to get that information. But of course, as soon as you have that information, it's stale, because as soon as you got that together, then there's a new shipment that's already gone out. There's a new subject that came in. There's a dose change. That it's constant changing information, and we always need to make sure that we have that global visibility. So I can jump into the solution side. So kind of came in and we worked very closely together, and the result was a transition to the Axiom Fusion eClinical suite, our RTSM, and we also utilize EDC, data management, CTMS as needed there as well. So this was 4 go-lives, 4 transitions over 6 months. There was 24 site activations, and the site activations, it might be, oh, it's just a little thing. There's reconciliation involved. Remember, we're using paper documentation and working with the monitors and making sure that, okay, well, you said that you received this bottle, but as per the depot, you really were only shipped this, this, and this. So lots of back and forths. There was the migrations as well as all the training to make sure everyone's comfortable with the new system and they're ready to get up and running and go with it. So then they can have that full visibility moving forward.
And so, to add, so Heather, one thing to add is that when we talked about going live and picking a date, where the system itself, I picked a date that, worked for the system, worked for the study, for each specific study. And one was after randomization, and it kind of fit into what worked as a whole. But those were system go lives. So where the system went live one day, it doesn't mean that every site was ready that day. There were sites that we, took a lot of work to get in their paper drug accountability. So even each site had its own quote unquote go live. The system itself did, but not every site used it on day one. We had some additional reconciliation to do before we allowed that particular site to use the system. So there was kind of 2 dates that it took us some time to get these sites acclimated to a system, because they didn't have to use one before. It was open label.
Yep, absolutely. And just going back to the scenario as well, that hits on our answer number A from a poll question. So that's the technology piece that we, the CTM traceability, as well as the ability to manage a more complex schema, and that's because this was the blinded study that then needed to transition over to the open label phase, and of course needed to manage the dispensing on both sides. So that was a key kind of trigger to move forward.
And it was also weight based, so you had to know the weight of the patients in order to determine the patient's dose. And there were different types of tablets.
And dose changes.
And you could modify the dose within the study. So the study had a lot of complexity to it, even from a design as well as IRT dispensing, and it took a lot of planning in order to build and, out of the box thinking and, sort of figuring out how to make this work, because you had to take the old information and fit it into the system because you weren't starting from scratch.
Exactly. And we won't even get into that it's a global study and we had to deal with Brexit and get new depots on board. There was lots of excitement there. But through these go lives and through this transition, then the result was accurate inventory, accurate visibility, as well as understanding what those upcoming needs are. For additional IP runs, for any upcoming expiries, whether there's an over-labeling or not, as well as getting ready to roll over in some cases between studies. So there was lots of different complexities that were really, it doesn't solve the complexity, but it gives you that visibility, and then you can focus on those key decisions instead of just trying to hunt for the data. So it kind of touches on the data access too, of course.
Exactly.
Okay, so this was our case on the mid-study transition. I'm going to quickly touch on our case 2, so then we can continue on here because I'm just doing a little bit of a time check. So really quickly, our second scenario, of course, was mid-study updates. There was end user challenges, so our answer D from before. So just a little bit of background, this was a study with cohort enrollment, including sentinel groups and refrigerated CTM. In this case, it's IP, and it was limited and did require just-in-time labeling and shipments. And the shipments were split up between kind of randomization and mid-study. So then there wasn't ever at any point too much inventory at site, just because of the limited IP and the temperature controls required. Additionally, we have our IWRS scenarios and accountability data entry delays. And so those are the two reasons why we move forward with some of these updates, as well as cohort-specific replacements that were required. Okay. So what happens? So we have these scenarios that are coming up that, of course, we're tracking and monitoring and assessing our options, looking at our risks, and the accountability, and that included the accountability data entry delays. So what did we do? We did some training material updates. We did an update to the resupply strategy, as well as replacement randomization updates. And so training materials, so that goes back to lots of calls into our 24/7 help desk. And so what did we do? When we recognize that there's a training material update required, we're going to go and we're going to make that update. In general, it's in real time. So we noted 0 days. That means that we have less help desk calls. So we have some real metrics that you can monitor and work with, as well as increasing monitor independence, because then the monitors are more comfortable and confident because they have that clear understanding of the tips and tools of the instructions. For the resupply strategy, we actually did a dispensing schedule update, kind of how they assign and dispense, as well as when what those triggers are to ship the additional resupplies. And it took about a week to get through those updates. And what that did was it meant that we actually were able to eliminate completely ad hoc shipments that were raising where it seemed like inventory was needed when it wasn't, based on some of those data entry delays and issues there, and didn't require cancellations. And of course, there can be costs depending on how soon those are identified. So it was really important from many different ways to make sure that we're streamlining this, and we're able to do that in just a week. The last item was the replacement randomization update. So initially, there was a little bit of hesitation around having that real-time replacement, which means that as soon as a subject is determined to be eligible for replacement, then you can assign, do that direct assignment of the corresponding treatment to the next subject that comes in. There was a little bit of hesitation, so the initial configuration was the end of cohort. So as soon as that sentinel group was completed, then any replacements could be assigned. And then at the end of the cohort, again, the replacements can be assigned. So what we were able to do was we kind of revisited. It's okay to revisit those discussions that you had earlier on. We kind of worked through and assessed, okay, what are the benefits? It was confirmed to move forward. So in 3 days, we were able to make sure that whenever a subject was identified that needed replacement, which we had at that time, then we can maintain that treatment balance at all times. So this is what I was talking about earlier. We're having a clear understanding of what kind of changes are possible and what those timelines are is really important to be able to determine if that's a good fit. And I think we're ready for our next poll question there.
Okay, then I will launch our second and final poll question. And here it is, audience members. There it is in front of you. This one here is apply all that that apply to you. The question is, what kind of RTSM selection decisions have you participated in? So what kind of RTSM selection decisions have you participated in? Please select all that apply. You have initial selection, mid-study transition, or mid-study updates. So please go ahead. I'll give you about 30 seconds to complete this poll. That's just a quick one. And it looks like we have the majority of our audience members have already cast their vote. So thank you very much, everyone, for doing that. I'll leave another few seconds for the remainder to go ahead and cast their vote. If you can go ahead and cast your vote now, that'd be greatly appreciated. Okay, and it looks like everyone has done so. Thank you, everyone, for doing that. Now I will close the polls and share the results. So here are the results from that poll question. What kind of RTSM selection decisions have you participated in? And we have here, looks like initial selection was the #1 choice at 100%. We have 0% at mid-study transition and 50% at mid-study update. So thank you, everyone, for participating in that last poll question. Now back to Lauren and Heather.
Okay, excellent. And thank you again for participating there. It's great to hear from you. And of course, lots of initial getting up and running, getting started, and mid-study updates. There's a lot of hesitation around having those mid-study transitions. And you, based on what we talked about, you really only want to be moving forward with that if it's really required. And it's all about that, looking at, weighing up the benefits and risks there. Okay, so just looking at the next section here, so the selection phase, we're going to touch on this briefly, as well as touch on our approach here at Axiom, so we can get and move forward into questions, a Q&A section. So here we just have a kind of a quick list. So just talking through these, and we've touched on quite a few, but we really want to make sure that you understand your own needs. So clearly defining those requirements like we talked about during that design phase. So doing all of that thinking and planning up front, aligning your internal stakeholders, and when you have those key requirements, then you're able to have more accurate quotes come into you, and of course minimal change orders down the road after you've kind of received your final budget. This also allows you to find the right fit, because it's not just a one-way partnership, it's a two-way partnership. So if you have certain requirements and those aren't communicated correctly, the technology partner might not be able to support it. So that's where you can run into issues there. So that goes on to the understanding your vendor capabilities. And you really need to make sure that you're having those initial discussions up front. So have those initial discussions, have a good understanding of what what their capabilities are. Are they an IRT provider? They just provide the IRT. Is it EDC with separate IRT where they have their own integration and partner, or is it a full eClinical suite? We also have the support, so making sure, do they have hands-on consulting up front? Do they have a customer support desk? And what level of support from the IRT expertise side. For data access, then we're talking about reports, the ability to customize, as well as looking at those end of study outputs, whether it's the sponsor and the site level. You need to make sure you have the access to the data at the end of study as well. Our last piece is just on agility. So being able to move quickly, whether it's the initial go live or those updates that we talked about earlier, making sure we can, that vendor can move quickly. And we're going to skip right into Axiom's approach and the benefits of centralized RTSM. Andrew, do you want to take us through?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. So thanks everybody for spending some time with us today. Just going to give you a brief overview about what we do at Axiom and Fusion specifically. So Fusion, as Heather mentioned, Fusion started life as an EDC platform and grew into a multi-module environment. What it allows you to do is really pick the modules that you need. So as Heather chatted about, if it was purely IRT as a quote-unquote standalone IRT activity, then Fusion will do that. If you actually just needed to run an ePro study and you want to collect patient-reported data, et cetera, you can do that directly. Next slide, Heather. So one of the potentials, though, is for Fusion to serve as a connected hub for all the study data. So single sign-on access into a lot of the information that you would go and look for in different environments can be pulled together centrally. And what that means is that you end up in an environment where you log in, you have access to all the reports, to all the key data you want to be able to see. I won't walk you through all of these modules, but essentially it's a menu cart. Choose the things that line up to your study. So it can be an incredibly simple study and I just need EDC and IRT. I might just need EDC, but you get to choose the elements that you want to pull together so that you have centralized access to all of that data. We're happy to chat with you offline regarding any questions that you might have regarding a unified platform. Next slide, Heather.
So I'll jump in here just to talk really briefly. So we do have our RTSM team and technology, and it's really important that we provide not only the ability to track the randomization, track your inventory data globally, but also having that guided support, the monitoring and tracking of scenarios, and having that oversight for all the activities throughout the study life cycle. We won't touch too much on that. Thank you, Andrew, for noting that earlier. And we'll jump right into just some quick notes. So when we're talking about the randomization tools, so of course we have that full flexibility, that full range, but one of those key items is utilizing it in a unified platform. So using the full suite, then you have centralized data, which means you have more flexibility, more controls. So here, without getting too into the details, you can see that there's data coming from the EDC, there's data coming from the inventory, as well as other modules, and that all is being brought together and used to calculate and determine the subject's eligibility. We're not talking about needing to do double data entry at the sites level. Especially when it comes to your subject details, your stratification factors, you can't have mistakes there. And you don't have to worry
Sorry,
about
Heather.
delays. Oh, yep.
Forgive me, I was just jumping in for a minute. I think, Lauren, you would agree, when they're separate and you're sitting with your IRT activity over here and the site's typing it in the IRT, and then you're like, but wait a minute, they didn't do any of the inclusion criteria. They just put in the basics for a patient. It can create chaos between the two.
Yeah, that's correct. And the nice thing about using all the modules is that you literally only add one piece of information, regardless of what module you put it in. It's still only one single data point on the back end of the database. And I think that not having to reconcile and compare across modules makes everybody's life easier.
Absolutely. And on the global inventory side, so everything done from the program-wide inventory to the site and subject level accountability is covered. And when we're talking about the inventory aspect, then again, it's bringing all that information together, looking at screening activity, looking at subject status updates, was there a dose change? You don't need to go in and update that in multiple systems. You're just updating it, adding that information once. On the accountability side, again, sometimes you're assigning in one system in the IRT and confirming the dispensing and the pill counts in another system. But when you have everything together, it's just that one data entry point and the one single sign-on. Weight-based dosing, looking at ePro to determine kind of if you need retraining, if there's compliance issues, all of that's happening in one central system. Andrew?
Thanks, Heather. Thanks everyone for going through this with us. We're gonna start a Q&A. Just before we wrap up on that, just kind of why talk to us as an organization. I'll tell you two quick reasons. We're absolutely relentless when it comes to the commitment to making the study work. And I think as Lauren mentioned in the conversation earlier, you plan for the best, you expect the worst, and I'm paraphrasing you, Lauren. But we know that the crap is going to hit the fan at some point in a study. It's just the nature of the beast. We're expecting dozens or hundreds of people to follow a set of instructions, and they just don't all fall out that way, and best planning doesn't necessarily get you there. So it's the commitment to making that study work that's really important. And that's one of the fundamentals for us at Axiom. And number two is really the technology makes your life that much easier. As Lauren commented, it's a single point of data. So you're not hunting down those data points, reconciling them, and so forth. So really changes how you run your studies. We're going to jump over to a Q&A and open the floor to Sonia to giving us a hand with that.
Certainly, yes, it is my pleasure to do that for you. Thank you very much, Andrew, Heather, and Lauren. First, I'd like to say thank you for that very insightful presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Now, I would like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments right now using the window for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So that's the questions windows that you see there. I've already received some questions from our audience members, and so I will begin with those. So Andrew, Heather, and Lauren, are you ready? Let's see how many we can get through the next little bit of time we have left. Okay, I got a bunch of them here that have come in.
Sonia,
Okay,
how much do we win if we get the answers right?
All right, gonna have to think about that one. Okay, here's our first question. How have IRT systems been affected by COVID-19? Well, that's a good question.
I'll jump in here. So I think that COVID-19 has really highlighted the need for flexibility and agility, especially on the remote capability side, the remote side of the technology. Some of those challenges that highlighted these needs on the randomization side, of course, we have screening, any delays in enrollment, the need to adjust eligibility requirements and adjust and release protocol amendments. And that brings us into the inventory side where we have changes to dispensing schedules, and that could be that the subjects are not able to return to site to get the new set of medication. So it either needs to be it needs to be tracked directly from the depot to the subject, so direct to patient, or if it's already on site, it needs to be couriered out to the subject. So there's a lot of quick changes that need to happen to be able to support that, and that just kind of touches on the first start of it. But really, you need to be able to kind of identify and look at those risks. You want to be doing that up front wherever possible. Of course, we couldn't have predicted the COVID-19 pandemic, but building as many of these flexibilities into our systems from the start means that we can act we can act quickly, or we can just be ready to go and just continue as is. So definitely something to continue to think about. Okay.
Anyone else want to add anything? Okay, I will go on to the next question then. The next question I have is, how do you take a proactive approach to monitoring risk?
So I'll take this one. So monitoring risk within the IRT and kind of proactively looking at it is really simple in the system. Being able to view your IP supply, whether it's in a depot or at a site level, it makes it easier for you to be able to see what supply you have and be able to go backwards. So you can use the system to then determine what you need in your depot, and then what you need to label before that, and then what you need to manufacture. So being able to use the system to kind of manage your risk on supply is something that's very important to, make sure you can continue to provide drug to these patients. And it's also nice to be able to see the overage at your site. You can build the overage into your supply. You can build it into the system and be able to determine how much overage you want at the site. Like I mentioned, I've done it where it's a bunch of different dosages. And so you need to be able to kind of even see your overage per dose and at the site. So you're able to kind of monitor the risk on supply all the way back prior to depot.
Okay, perfect. Andrew, anything else to add?
Nope. Thanks, Sonia.
Okay, no problem. All right, here's our next question then. How much impact can the right RTSM system make to improve study efficiency?
I can take a shot, maybe just to start the dialogue there for a minute. I think there's a lot of change in IRT. I'm going to come back to your question, Sonia, in a kind of roundabout way. IRT at the end of the day is, we know, 50% of the component. You need the primary study data, and then you need to be able to manage the IRT accordingly. And I think the kind of old school way of thinking about it was so focused on a massive configuration of IRT, but it kind of sometimes loses out on the front end of what needs to happen for that end user. So the pharmacist, the study coordinator who's doing the randomization, the simplicity that's needed, coming back to Lauren and Heather's comments about really easy to use tools and guides to be able to make it really simple. So I really think that if you think about a modern IRT, there's just a tremendous amount that can be accomplished if it's well-planned, well-designed, and truly focused on the real end users that are using it. And of course, that includes the sponsor team managing the supply, regardless of what it is.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, and we have a lot of questions here that have come in from the audience, but we're looking at the time here, so let's try this last one to see if we can squeeze this in. And the question is, what is the buffer time period required to reconfigure an IRT for adaptive studies, adjusting as new data comes in?
So when we're looking at, sorry, I'll jump in here. So when we're looking at the planned updates for adaptive studies, then there's a couple different things. So this falls under our mid-study changes bucket. And for these updates, of course, you do as much planning as you can up front. You have a general idea of what the potential scenarios are, or so you can have as much of it ready to go. And then when you're actually going in and making those changes, then it can be anything from kind of 3 to 5 days for a minor update, 2 weeks for larger updates. And when you're looking at, if it's just a change of an enrollment cap, a change of maybe we're going to activate a different dose or a different cohort, then that can be handled in real time as well. So it really varies depending on the scenario. And of course, it always goes back to planning ahead as much as possible. So if it does fall into one of those potential scenarios, you're already ready to go. You have the documentation, you have the requirements, you have the workflow. You've already gone through those discussions. So you can really cut down on the time to go live.
Anyone else like to add anything before I close up this part of the Q&A? Lauren or Andrew? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for those questions. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Axiom Real-Time Metrics may follow up with you, or actually they will follow up with you after this presentation. If you have any further questions, please direct them to the email address that's on your screen. And there it is, solutions@axiom.cc, or you can dial 1-877-321-9191, or please just go and check out their website at axiommatrix.com. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event at that link, and also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. And we get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting materials that are available under the Handouts tab. And we have two for you today. One is Axiom Fusion eClinical Suites RTSM-IWRS Summary and Axiom Fusion Overview Booklet. So please go ahead and check out the Handouts tab and download those two great articles there. So now please join us in thanking our speakers, Andrew Schachter, founder and CEO of Axiom Real-Time Metrics, Heather DiFrusicia, Associate Director of IWRS RTSM at Axiom Real-Time Metrics, and Lauren Glenn, Director of Clinical Operations at SwanBio Therapeutics, for that very insightful and detailed presentation. Thank you, everyone. We hope you
Thank-
found this, no, thank you. We hope you
Thanks,
found this
guys.
webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator, but I think Andrew has something else to say. Go ahead, Andrew, do the big send off.
Oh, I was going to thank Heather for a great presentation, Lauren for generously volunteering her time to participate with us. Lauren, greatly appreciate it. Really, really enjoyed today. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. On behalf of the team here at X Talks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye, everyone. Bye, Andrew. Bye, Heather. Bye, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Bye.
Bye-bye.